What did you really know about the invincibility of the Vikings? History conceals facts that make your blood run cold. Imagine a force that turned the legendary northern warriors from hunters into helpless prey. Who were these people who dared not just to fight back, but to unleash a total massacre on Europe's most terrifying pirates? In this video, we will crack open one of the most brutal and silenced chapters of the Middle Ages. You will learn how yesterday's forest savages, destined for slavery, brought Sweden to its knees, burned its religious capital, and stole its holiest relic. We will tell you how elite knights of the Teutonic Order, encased in the finest steel, choked in swamp mud, beaten to death with simple clubs, and why the Pope was deceived by the most cunning king in history. How did tribes doomed to extinction manage to build an empire from sea to sea on the ruins of their enemies? What terrible price did they pay for their freedom? And why, to defeat the dragon, did they have to become monsters themselves? Watch to the end. This truth will overturn your understanding of who the real masters of Europe were. Welcome to the history of fury. The salty air no longer smells of freedom. It smells of burnt pitch, scorched flesh, and total, primal terror. Imagine standing on the deck of a legendary longship. The very dragon whose silhouette has made monks in Britain and France wet their robes in fear for centuries. You are a Viking. You are the top of the food chain. You are used to the world being your personal supermarket, where goods are paid for with steel and change is taken in slaves. But today, something has gone wrong. The water around you is boiling not from a storm, but from falling bodies. Your brothers, clad in heavy chainmail, are sinking to the bottom, blowing bloody bubbles before they even have a chance to swing an axe. Because the hunter has suddenly turned into the prey. Welcome to the end of the 12th century, the moment when the Baltic ceased to be a Scandinavian lake and turned into a mass grave for those who considered themselves invincible. We are used to the glossy image of history, stern northerners ruling the seas, while somewhere over there, on the eastern shore, in the backwoods, sit frightened savages waiting their turn to become merchandise in slave markets. Forget it. That is a lie. By the end of the 1180s, the situation had flipped upside down. Those whom the Swedes and Danes were used to considering talking cattle, Estonians, Curonians, Uselians, did not just snap back. They learned the lessons of their tormentors, perfected their methods, and now came to collect debts. And the interest on those debts was monstrous. Look at this scene not as a viewer of a blockbuster, but as an investigator at a crime scene. What do we see? The Swedish fleet, the pride of the crown, has been turned into a pile of drifting debris. This is not a fair duel in the open sea. This is an execution. The Baltic tribes did not build giant ships to measure keel length with the Vikings. They acted smarter and meaner. Their vessels are nimble, low-riding predators, perfectly adapted for shallow waters and skerries. They swooped in like a pack, cutting off retreat routes, pelting decks with pots of combustible mixtures, and showering the Scandinavians with a hail of arrows. Chroniclers of that time whine on the pages of annals, unable to believe what was happening. You can understand them. It was cognitive dissonance, breaking the psyche. As if today a flock of sheep organized and tore a pack of wolves to pieces. Scandinavians had lived for centuries in the paradigm of their impunity. They believed the sea belonged to them by birthright, granted by Odin. This arrogance became their sentence. They missed the moment when the forest barbarians mastered navigation, copied sail rigging, and, most terrifying of all, realized their strength. The atmosphere of this battle is saturated not with the heroic pathos of sagas, but with sticky panic. Vikings, the best swordsmen in Europe, proved useless. What good is your swordsmanship if your longship is already burning and the enemy does not enter close combat, shooting you from a safe distance? It was a technological and tactical revolution. The Curonians and Ocelians brought total war to the Baltic. They did not take prisoners for ransom, as was customary in the noble wars of the West. They simply cleared the space. Listen to the sound of this rout. The crack of breaking masts, the hissing of fire devouring tarred wood, and the screams of men who for the first time in their lives encountered someone more cruel than themselves. The waters of the Baltic Sea that day accepted hundreds of Sweden's best warriors. Their heavy gear, which had served as protection for centuries, now became an anchor, pulling them to the bottom. The Ocelians, inhabitants of the island of Saaremaa, and the Curonians, the Baltic Vikings as they would later be called with caution and respect, acted with the cold efficiency of butchers. This event was the point of no return. The myth of Scandinavian invincibility didn't just crack, it was shattered into smithereens and trampled into the bloodied deck. For the Baltic tribes, this was an initiation. They tasted the blood of their main enemy and realized it was no different from any other. It is just as red and spills just as easily. The fear that had paralyzed the coast from the mouth of the Vistula to the Gulf of Finland for centuries vanished. In its place came rage. The rage of people who had been backed into a corner for too long. Do you think this was just a lucky ambush? An accident? No. It was a system. While Swedish kings feasted in their halls, discussing raids on Britain, a new power grew right under their noses. A power that did not recognize the cross, despised Scandinavian gods, and believed only in steel and fire. The psychological effect of this defeat was comparable to the fall of Rome for the ancient world. Sweden, used to being the predator, suddenly felt the cold breath of death on the back of its neck. But the worst was yet to come for the Scandinavians. Survivors of this massacre returned home not as heroes, but as harbingers of the apocalypse. Their stories of demons from the east who knew no fear or pity sowed seeds of paranoia in the minds of the Swedish elite. The royal court was in shock. How to react? What to do when your slave pantry suddenly starts burning your own villages? The answer seemed obvious to a medieval monarch. A punitive expedition is needed. A show of force is needed. This rebellion must be drowned in blood so that others don't get any ideas. The empire, having received a slap in the face, began to prepare a counterstrike, in its blind fury not even suspecting that it was walking into an even more terrible trap. The Swedish king, listening to reports of burned ships, already saw in his dreams his army landing on the eastern shore and setting fire to savage settlements. He thought it would be a cakewalk, a punitive raid, a hunt for presumptuous beasts. He did not yet know that the prey had long studied the hunter's habits and prepared a welcome for him that would make hell itself shudder. The wind filled the sails of the royal fleet, carrying it east toward destruction, while in the dark forests of Kurland, knives were already being sharpened, waiting for guests. King Knut was sure of victory, but the forest, ancient and gloomy, knows how to keep its secrets until the last moment. The Swedish fleet crashed into the sand of the Kurland coast with the confidence of a rhinoceros seeing nothing but the target. King Knut stood at the prow of the flagship, inhaling the damp air of a foreign land. Victory hymns were already playing in his head. He brought here not just a band of marauders, but a real army, clad in iron and righteous anger. The plan was as simple as a hammer blow. Land, find the enemy, force a pitched battle, crush him with sheer mass, and return everything to normal. The Scandinavians thirsted for blood. They wanted to see fear in the eyes of those who dared to burn their ships. But instead of roaring hordes of barbarians, they were met with silence. Imagine this moment. Thousands of men armed to the teeth spill onto the shore. They bang swords against shields, shout curses, challenge local chiefs to single combat. But the answer is only the cry of a seagull and the sound of the surf. The beach is empty.
Villages that should have been full of slaves and loot stand deserted. It was like a punch into the void that dislocates your shoulder. The Swedish commanders exchanged glances. Where is the enemy? Ran away? Scared of the crown's might? Arrogance played a cruel joke on them. They decided the Balts had fled to their burrows in terror. Cowards, laughed the knights, adjusting their belts. They didn't understand one thing. The emptiness before them was not a sign of weakness. It was the maw of a trap. The king gave the order to move deeper into the mainland, and here the real war began. A war for which the Vikings, accustomed to open shield-to-shield clashes or fast raids, were absolutely unprepared. The forest in Courland is not a park for strolling. It is a dense, suffocating green wall where sunlight dies before reaching the ground. Trees stand so close that cavalry becomes a burden. Roots hidden under moss break horses' legs. Swamps covered in duckweed wait for anyone who steps off the path. The Swedish column, stretching for miles, resembled a shiny snake slowly crawling into the stomach of a giant predator. The first days passed in nervous tension. The Swedes found settlements, but found only ash there. The Curonians applied scorched earth tactics. No grain, no livestock, no clean water. Wells were poisoned with animal carcasses, barns burned to the ground. The royal army, counting on feeding itself through plunder, began to starve. A soldier's stomach is the timer of any military campaign, and this timer began counting down. But hunger was only half the trouble. The main enemy became the forest itself. Have you ever felt a gaze on you when no one is around? That feeling of sticky fear crawling down your back. That is exactly how the Swedish veterans felt. The forest looked at them with thousands of eyes. Death came without warning. A whistle, and an arrow with black fletching pierces the throat of the rear guard. No sound of a bowstring, no battle cry. Just a man falling face down in the mud, and the forest remaining motionless. Scouts sent to check the flanks did not return. They were not found dead. They simply vanished, dissolved in the fog, as if erased from reality. Psychological pressure grew by the hour. At night, the Swedish camp turned into an abode of nightmares. Sentries swore they saw shadows gliding between the trees. Someone heard a twig snap right by their ear. Soldiers slept hugging their swords, flinching at every rustle. And in the morning, they found their comrades with slit throats right by the fires. No one heard a thing. The Curonians and Semi-Gallians moved in their forest silently as ghosts. They knew every path, every ravine. They became part of the landscape, merged with it to kill. It was a war of nerves. King Knut was furious. He demanded a battle. He wanted to see the enemy, wanted to hack his flesh, break his bones. But you cannot kill fog. You cannot challenge a swamp to a duel. The great Swedish army, capable of crushing any opponent in an open field, proved powerless against an enemy who refused to play by the rules of knightly honor. "Come out and fight, cowardly dogs!" the king roared into the thicket. And in response, an arrow flew out, piercing the shoulder of his standard-bearer. It was humiliation, a slow, methodical grinding of morale. After 2 weeks of aimless wandering through the forests, the army began to rot from within. Discipline collapsed. Desertion began, but there was nowhere to run. The forest devoured lone men even faster.
Diseases caused by rotten water and dampness mowed down the ranks better than any sword. Those who just yesterday laughed at the savages now prayed to their gods just to get out of this green hell alive. Greatness was replaced by animal fear. Soldiers began to whisper that they were fighting not men, but forest spirits that could not be killed with steel. The king, broken and humiliated, was forced to give the order to retreat. And this path back to the saving ships became the final act of the tragedy. As soon as the Swedes turned their backs, the ghosts materialized. The Balts attacked the retreating column from all sides. They struck the tail, cut off stragglers, drove the wounded into the quagmire. It was not a battle, but a driven hunt. Proud warriors of the north ran to the sea, abandoning loot, abandoning weapons, abandoning wounded comrades. They ran, losing their human semblance, driven by only one instinct: to survive. When the miserable remnants of the punitive expedition boarded the ships and pushed off from the cursed shore, they thought it was all over. They survived. They would return home, lick their wounds, and try to forget this disgrace like a bad dream. In their eyes, one could read relief. The sea is their element. Here they are safe. The forest remained behind. But they were mistaken. Fatally mistaken. While the Swedish fleet rotted in fruitless attempts to conquer the forest, and King Knut lost authority in the eyes of the nobility, a new plan had already matured on the eastern shore. Baltic chiefs, standing on the dunes and watching the receding sails, did not celebrate victory. They looked further. Defense was over. The lesson was learned. As long as the snake has a head, it will bite. It is not enough just to chase the enemy from your land. You must go to his home and show him what true terror is. The gaze of the victors glided over the leaden waves to the west, to where the heart of Swedish power lay beyond the horizon. A city full of gold, temples, and self-assured fools who considered themselves invulnerable. Sigtuna, the pearl of Lake Mälaren, the political and religious center of Sweden. They thought the complex fairway and distance from the sea would protect them. They thought the bronze gates of their cathedrals were as unshakable as faith itself. But in the fog of the Baltic, sails of the fleet of retribution were already rising, and this time it was not Vikings sailing on the longships. Imagine living inside a safe. Your home is not just a fortress, it is the heart of an empire hidden deep inside, behind hundreds of miles of skerries, straits, and watchtowers. You are sure that war is something that happens somewhere far away, on barbarian shores, where your brave soldiers bring the light of civilization to savages. You wake up in the morning, hear the ringing of church bells, smell fresh bread, and think your life is inviolable. That is exactly how the inhabitants of Sigtuna felt in the summer of the year 1187. They did not know they had only a few hours left to live. Sigtuna was not just a city. It was Sweden's nerve center, its religious capital, the place where the main shrines and treasury were kept. It was impossible for an enemy to get here, so said the official propaganda. To enter Lake Mälaren, one had to pass through a labyrinth of islands, each of which should have been a grave for an invader. But on that summer morning, the horizon turned black not from storm clouds. It turned black from sails. Karelians and Estonians, those same forest ghosts whom the Swedes despised, did the impossible. They guided their fleet through the tangled archipelago unnoticed, like wolves slipping into a sheepfold while the shepherds slept. This was not a robbery. This was a punitive operation, a surgically precise strike at the very heart of national pride. When the first ships hit the piers, the city was still sleeping the lethargic sleep of security.
And then, hell began. The barbarians did not waste time on negotiations or a siege. They surged into the streets in a single stream, sweeping away the weak guard. Local garrisons, used to chasing drunks in taverns, clashed with professional killers who had passed natural selection in swamps and forests. Look at this scene. Stone pavements that Swedes had polished for generations instantly became slippery with blood. Sigtuna burned. But it was not just a fire where wooden shacks crackle. History was burning. Pagans from the east did not come for grain or fabrics. They came to kill gods. The main target became the cathedral, the symbol of Christian dominance. Inside, at the altar, in his gold-embroidered robes, stood Archbishop Johannes of Uppsala. He clutched a crucifix, believing the sanctity of the place would stop the barbarians. What naivety. For the attackers, he was not God's vicar, but the leader of an enemy pack, a priest of an alien cult who blessed crusades on their lands. The death of the archbishop was not from a stray arrow. It was an execution. He was hacked down right at the altar, mixing holy water with arterial blood. At that moment, the Swedish nation received a punch to the gut from which it could not catch its breath for decades. Imagine the shock. The vicar of Christ killed by pagans in the country's holiest place. It was a signal to the entire Christian world. Your God is powerless here. Your magic does not work. We came into your home, killed your priests, and burned your shrines. But the most humiliating part was not even the murder. The most terrible thing was what happened next. When the smoke of fires began to veil the sun and the screams of the dying subsided, the victors did something that would forever enter history as a symbol of Swedish shame. They approached the main city gates, the famous bronze gates of Sigtuna, a masterpiece of blacksmithing art, the pride of the city. They didn't just break them down. They carefully removed them from their hinges. Why drag tons of bronze across the sea? Not from melting. It was a trophy, a symbol. To deprive a city of its gates means to symbolically castrate it, strip it of protection and status. It was a message. We can come to you whenever we want and leave taking whatever we like. The Swedes watched from the forest, where the few survivors had managed to flee, as their main relic was loaded onto barbarian ships. Great Sweden, the terror of the seas, stood on its knees watching its honor being carted off toward the sunrise. Sigtuna never recovered. The city that was supposed to become the capital of the empire turned into ruins. The government was forced to flee, founding a new center, Stockholm, further from open water, hiding behind even deeper straits. But fear settled in souls for a long time. The echo of Sigtuna's fall spread through all the courts of Europe. Kings and bishops whispered in the corridors, if these savages could burn Sigtuna, who is safe? Barbarians ceased to be just a problem on the border. They became an existential threat. And the fleet of the victors went back east. The ships sat deep in the water, loaded with gold, weapons, and slaves. But the main cargo was those very bronze gates. They lay on the bottom of a longship, gleaming dully in the light of the setting sun, reflecting a sky that no longer belonged to Scandinavian gods. The gates sailed away into the fog, to disappear from Swedish history and resurface hundreds of miles away, becoming the decoration of a cathedral in Novgorod, as an eternal reminder of the day the hunter became the prey. This bronze became the period at the end of the sentence concluding the Viking Age. The old world collapsed along with the gates of Sigtuna, and in the fog of the Baltic, a new reality was already ripening, where rules were dictated not by the power of tradition, but by speed, cruelty, and the steel grip of those who just yesterday were considered victims. And now these wolves of the sea felt the taste of real blood. Their appetite was only growing. The sea waited for new masters. Those very bronze gates of Sigtuna, disappearing into the fog, became not just a decoration for a Novgorod temple. They slammed the lid on the coffin of the era of Scandinavian naval supremacy. The sea, which Vikings had called their backyard for centuries, suddenly became a death trap for them. If before the appearance of a sail on the horizon caused panic in Baltic villages, now panic seized the skippers of merchant cogs and captains of war longships at the sight of an empty horizon. Because death no longer came openly, to the roar of trumpets and clashing of shields, it learned to sneak up silently, like a predatory fish from the deep. The era of wolf pack tactics arrived. Forget majestic naval battles where giant flotillas clash wall to wall. The Baltic tribes, Curonians, Uselians, Sambians, were pragmatists to the bone. They did not suffer from gigantomania, and did not build floating fortresses requiring centuries-old oaks and years of work. Their bet was placed on speed, maneuverability, and frightening cheapness. Their boats, light, flat-bottomed, swift, could pass where the keel of a heavy Scandinavian ship would rip open the bottom. They hid in skerries, in river mouths, in reed thickets, becoming invisible to clumsy giants. The Baltic turned into a minefield, where every island could hide an ambush. Imagine yourself in the place of a Swedish helmsman in the early 13th century. You are following a usual trade route. The wind is favorable, the sea is calm, and suddenly the water around you seems to boil. From all sides, out of the morning mist, a dozen or maybe 24 predatory boats rush at you. You don't have time to turn your heavy ship. You don't even have time to assemble the crew on deck. This is not a duel. This is a beating. The wolf pack works smoothly, without unnecessary commands, obeying a single rhythm of killing. They don't ram, they pinch. The most terrible weapon of the wooden fleet comes into play: fire. The bolts did not intend to board your ships to claim them. Why would they want these clumsy coffins? They needed to destroy you. Pots of combustible mixture, burning arrows, tar torches flew onto the decks of longships. Dry, salted wood flared up like gunpowder. And now, the pride of northern shipbuilding turns into a blazing torch drifting on the waves. The crew has a terrible choice: burn alive or jump into the ice-cold water, where men with hooks and spears are already waiting for them. In these clashes, there was no place for chivalry or a code of honor. It was a total cleansing of the water area. Baltic pirates acted with the efficiency of pathologists. They cut the trade arteries of Gotland and Sweden. Rich merchant cities that just yesterday counted profits now counted losses and widows. The Baltic Sea, once Varangian, rapidly turned into a Lithuanian lake, or, to be more precise, the hunting grounds of Curonian kings. Trade was paralyzed. The price of iron and salt skyrocketed because not a single ship could guarantee cargo delivery. Chronicles of that time ceased singing Viking exploits and filled with sparse, terror-filled reports of missing flotillas. "No one returned." This phrase became the refrain of the era. Scandinavians, used to being predators, were surprised to find their claws dulled and teeth knocked out. They tried to snap back, sent punitive detachments, but it was like trying to chop water with a sword. The wolf pack scattered before the blow, only to gather again behind the enemy's back and sink its teeth into his throat. By the end of the first quarter of the 13th century, the balance of power had changed completely. The North no longer dictated its terms. Fear changed its address. Now it lived not in Curonian villages, but in the harbors of Visby and Sigtuna. The Uselians and Curonians became the new masters of the sea, and every person daring to enter their waters paid their tax in blood. But history does not tolerate stasis. While Scandinavians choked on their own blood in salt water, and Baltic chiefs reveled in their naval triumph, a new threat began to form on the horizon. A threat that could not be handled with fast boats, fire, or forest ambushes. The wind changed. It brought from the west not the smell of salt and fish, but the heavy metallic smell of incense and red-hot iron. Where scattered bands of Vikings thirsting for gold used to land, men were now coming ashore who didn't need just to plunder. They didn't need slaves or silver, they needed souls. And they brought with them technology against which the wooden shields of pagans were no stronger than paper. Replacing the wooden dragon rotting on the bottom, an iron machine crawled in, knowing no doubts. The era of raids was ending. The era of the Crusades was beginning. And this enemy did not intend to play cat and mouse. He came to build his own stone order on the bones of the old world. You thought you won. You thought that by driving the Swedes into the cold waters of the Baltic and turning the sea into your hunting grounds, you secured your safety. What a monstrous mistake. The victory over the Vikings played a cruel joke on the Baltic tribes. It made them believe that war is raids, robbery, and fast skirmishes. They prepared for the war of yesterday, but the sun of a new era was already rising on the horizon. An era where death wears not hides and chainmail, but white cloaks with red and black crosses. An era where war is not a craft, but an industry. Meat, iron death. These were not pirates looking for easy money. It was a machine. A cold, bureaucratic, technologically flawless destruction machine, lubricated by fanatical faith and German gold. In the year 1201, Bishop Albert landed at the mouth of the Daugava. He did not bring a crowd of screaming berserkers. He brought engineers, stonemasons, and professional killers who had taken a vow of chastity and obedience. And the first thing they did was start building. Imagine the horror of a forest hunter who comes out to a clearing and sees something unnatural growing in place of the usual wooden hill fort. Stone. Gray, cold blocks stacked in perfect geometric shapes. The Balts lived in a world of wood. Their gods lived in trees. Their fortresses were of logs that burned, rotted, and smelled of life. Crusader castles smelled of nothing but dampness and lime. It was alien technology. You cannot burn stone. You cannot chop through it with an axe. Riga, founded by Albert, became a cancerous tumor on the body of the Baltic. It grew, devouring space, and its stone walls were a manifesto. We are here, forever. If Vikings were wolves, the Order of the Sword Brothers and the Teutons who came after them became an armored rhinoceros. Against light Baltic infantry and riders on small horses came heavy, knightly cavalry. The tanks of the Middle Ages. Imagine half a ton of living weight, a war destrier encased in armor, carrying a rider who had learned only one thing since childhood: to kill from the saddle. When such a wedge, formed in a swine formation, broke into a gallop, the earth literally trembled. This rumble was felt in the diaphragm for kilometers. The impact of such a wedge did not just break the line, it turned people into ground meat. Wooden shields shattered into splinters, bones snapped like dry twigs. Stopping a speeding knight with a club or light spear was as realistic as stopping an avalanche with your palm. But the newcomers had another surprise: the crossbow. For Balts honoring the bow and personal marksmanship, this device seemed like a devilish mechanism. A bow requires strength, training, merging with the weapon. A crossbow requires only one thing: pressing a trigger lever. Click. And a heavy, short bolt with a faceted tip punches through chainmail and flesh and exits through the back, tearing lungs. It was the weapon of mass destruction of that era. mechanical death equalizing a great warrior and yesterday's peasant. Knights shot down defenders of hill forts from a safe distance, methodically, as if at a shooting range, giving not a single chance for a counterstrike. However, the Order's most terrible weapon was not steel. It was ideology. Vikings needed your things and your bodies for sale. They didn't care what gods you prayed to, as long as you paid tribute. Crusaders came for your essence. Their ultimatum was simple and monstrous: baptism or death. There is no third option. It was a war for the total destruction of identity. Bishop Albert and the Masters of the Order did not negotiate with pagan dogs as equals. They looked at them as weeds that needed to be either cultivated or pulled out by the roots. The psychological effect of colliding with this machine was paralyzing. Tribes that just yesterday celebrated victory over Sweden suddenly realized their insignificance. Their ambush tactics didn't work against stone walls. Their rage shattered against the formation of iron men who moved as a single organism, obeying the orders of masters. Chronicler Henry of Latvia describes with sadistic pleasure how villages burned, how chiefs, proud and rebellious, crawled in the mud, kissing the boots of conquerors, begging for life in exchange for betraying their gods. The Baltic plunged into an atmosphere of hopelessness. It seemed resistance was futile. The god of the aliens was stronger. His houses were of stone. His servants were of iron. His will was unbending. The Order of the Sword Brothers methodically tightened the ring. They built castles on key roads, blocked rivers, created strongholds from which they launched their deadly raids. It was not a war of armies. It was a planned cleansing of the territory from infidels. Each new castle was a nail in the coffin of tribal freedom. But history is not a straight line. It is a spiral. And even the most perfect machine has a vulnerability. Knights, intoxicated by their successes, believed in their divine invulnerability, just as the Swedes once did. They forgot that iron has weight, that a tank is useless where there is no solid ground. They forgot to look under their feet. And there, under the hooves of their mighty horses, squelched the greasy, dirty, treacherous Baltic quagmire. Nature, which they tried to shackle in stone, was preparing its answer. And this answer would sound not with the roar of trumpets, but with the squelching sound with which heavy armor sinks into a swamp. The Crusaders decided they had broken the back of the savages. They began to behave not as warriors, but as masters who had lost vigilance. In the autumn of the year 1236, they went on another plundering campaign, which they proudly called a crusade. They marched merrily, with wagon trains full of looted goods, anticipating feasts in Riga. They did not know they were not marching to a parade. They were marching into a solar trap. Saule waited for them. And this time the barbarians had no stone walls. They had something better: mud, and the knowledge that even an Iron Man drowns if pushed correctly. The September sun of the year 1236 shone dimly, as if ashamed of what it was about to illuminate. A huge column of Crusaders and their allies crawled through the swamps on the border of Lithuania and Courland like a gluttonous snake. They were returning from a raid. Wagons were bursting with looted goods, lines of slaves trudged behind carts, and knights of the Order of the Sword Brothers lazily chatted in saddles, discussing how they would spend their share. They were drunk on impunity. They had passed with fire through the lands of the Samogitians without meeting resistance, and decided that the savages had once again run to their burrows. Master Volkwin, an experienced warrior, felt something was wrong. His back, used to the weight of plate armor, felt that chill one gets before a knife strike. But his brothers, these arrogant aristocrats from Germany, laughed at caution. They were sure. God is on their side, and steel is more reliable than prayer. They were mistaken. God took a day off that day,
and the landscape decided to join the war on the side of the pagans. The terrain called Saule is not a tournament field. It is a labyrinth of bushes, streams, and boggy, squelching mud covered by a thin layer of sod. When the Order's vanguard ran into a small river, they saw them. Samogitians. They didn't hide. They stood on the other bank, silent and calm, blocking the ford. And at that moment, the trap snapped shut. From behind, from the forest that seemed empty, the main Lithuanian forces emerged. The Crusaders were in a bag. Look at the situation through a knight's eyes. You are sitting on a huge warhorse. You are wearing over 60 pounds of iron. Your horse is also in armor. It is the perfect machine for a battering ram strike on flat, hard ground. But here, in the swamp, you are an elephant in a china shop. Master Volkwin, understanding the horror of the situation, gives the only correct order. Dismount! Form a circle! Protect the train! It was a chance to survive. A foot knight is still a tank capable of holding a defense, but pride is a terrible thing. The brother knights mutinied. We will not knead mud with our boots like commoners. We will not abandon our horses, they shouted. This refusal became their death sentence. They preferred to die in the saddle rather than fight on foot. And the Samogitians granted their wish. The Battle of Saule was not a battle in the usual sense. It was a slaughter of innocents, only instead of innocents, there were Europe's elite killers. Lithuanian light cavalry and infantry did not rush headlong. They acted like a school of piranhas. They circled around the clumsy armada bogged down in the quagmire, showering it with a hail of javelins. A horse hit in the unprotected belly falls, dragging the rider with it. And a knight fallen in the mud is no longer a warrior. He is a turtle flipped on its back. He cannot get up. The mud sucks him in. The armor presses him to the earth. And above him looms a grinning pagan with a club. Chronicles do not describe the ringing of swords. They describe dull thuds. The Samogitians realized there is no point in piercing expensive German steel. It is easier to break what is inside. Heavy clubs and maces crushed helmets, turning the heads of proud nobles into a bloody mess right inside their shiny buckets. Elite warriors of the Order, who studied fencing for years, died choking on swamp slurry, beaten like cattle with simple wooden logs. It was a scene from a technocrat's nightmare. Primitive fury defeats high technology thanks to the geometry of the battlefield. Master Volkwin fought to the last, trying to organize at least some semblance of formation, but he was surrounded and hacked down along with the remnants of his retinue. That day, the flower of the Order of the Sword Brothers fell in the swamps of Saule. 48 full brother knights is not just a number. It was the management backbone of the organization. Losing so many commanders in one day means losing the head. 2,000 rank-and-file warriors and mercenaries lay beside them, fertilizing with their bodies the very land they came to conquer. The panic that seized the survivors was animalistic. Those who managed to break out of the ring ran toward Riga, abandoning weapons and ripping off cloaks with crosses so as not to become targets. Local inhabitants, the Semigallians, who seemed to be allies of the Order, seeing which way the wind blew, immediately switched sides and began finishing off the fleeing men in the forests. Only every 10th man reached Riga. It was not just a rout, it was a catastrophe. The Order of the Sword Brothers, which terrorized the entire Baltic, effectively ceased to exist as an independent force. Their myth of invincibility drowned in the swamp, along with the Master. Saule became a cold shower for the entire Catholic world. It turned out that the Lord does not guarantee victory to idiots who go into a swamp on horses. Riga froze in anticipation of an assault. It seemed that now Lithuanian regiments would emerge from the forest,
and throw the remnants of the Germans into the sea. But the Samogitians did not storm the stone walls. It was enough for them that they broke the enemy's back in the field. However, a power vacuum is never eternal. Weakened, bled dry, the Order of the Sword Brothers was forced to seek salvation. They crawled on their knees to their competitors, the Teutonic Order. "Take us in, or we will disappear," was their message. A merger happened. The Teutons, a more powerful, rich, and rigid organization, absorbed the remnants of the Sword Brothers, creating their branch in Livonia. The death machine was restarted. Now it became even more dangerous because it received a vaccination against arrogance. New masters, the Teutonic Knights, looked at the map and decided to change vectors. If Lithuanian swamps are death, maybe it's worth trying luck in the north, where Russians live, where frozen lakes create ideal, flat platforms for heavy cavalry. Ice is hard, after all. It will support the weight of German order. So they thought, unfurling their banners toward Pskov and Novgorod, not suspecting that on the shore of Lake Peipus, a young prince was already waiting for them, who also knew how to use the landscape as a doomsday weapon. And the ice they counted on so much was preparing a treacherous surprise for them, scarier than any quagmire. The mud of Saule taught Crusaders to fear soft ground, but it did not teach them humility. Having licked their wounds and absorbed the remnants of the disgraced Sword Brothers, the Teutonic Order, this monster of military monastic bureaucracy, decided to shift the vector of attack. If the swamps of the south are death, then the north, with its endless winters and lakes hard as stone, seemed the perfect bridgehead. Knights looked at the map and saw a prize there worth the risk. Pskov and Novgorod, rich merchant republics, gateways to the endless resources of the east. Moreover, their inhabitants were schismatics, wrong Christians, which meant that from the Vatican's point of view, they differed little from pagans. Killing them was not a sin, but a godly deed. On an April morning in the year 1242, on the ice of Lake Peipus, the death machine, honed to perfection, lined up. The famous swine, a formidable wedge where in the first row, stirrup to stirrup, stood knights on huge horses encased in the best European steel. Infantry hid inside the wedge, and more heavy horsemen brought up the rear. It was a living battering ram, capable of breaking any wall, demolishing any formation, trampling any will. The Germans were confident. They had already taken Pskov. They smelled easy prey. The ice under hooves seemed reliable as German order. They failed to consider only one thing. On the other side, not a frightened mayor was waiting for them, but young Prince Alexander, whom history would remember as Nevsky. And this man intended to play not a knightly duel with them, but chess for survival. Alexander perfectly understood that in a head-on collision with the Iron Swine, his militia had no more chance than a wooden fence against a battering ram. So he bet on psychology and physics. He arranged his troops by the steep bank near Raven's Rock, intentionally weakening the center and strengthening the flanks. It was classic bait. He invited the German beast to strike at the very heart, get bogged down in combat, and expose its armored sides. The battle began with a roar that seemed to crack the sky. The Teutonic wedge slammed into the center of the Russian formation. A monstrous grinding of metal on metal rang out, the crack of breaking spears, and screams of people being trampled into the ice. The Germans, as Alexander calculated, punched through the center. They already saw the backs of fleeing enemies. They already tasted victory. But it was an illusion. Passing through the formation like a knife through butter, the heavy cavalry ran into the steep, snow-covered bank. Turning such a machine on a dime is an impossible task. The wedge stopped. The momentum of the attack faded, and at that moment, the trap snapped shut. From the flanks struck the Russian cavalry. Imagine this horror. You are encased in plate armor. You sit on a horse, sliding its hooves on bloody ice. You cannot turn around, and from the sides and rear, light, maneuverable riders attack you, striking with hooks, pulling you from the saddle. A knight fallen on the ice is a dead man. He slides. He cannot find purchase. His heaviness works against him. The vaunted German formation turned into a heap, a meat grinder where technology lost to fury and cunning. And then the ice itself came into play. Historians still argue whether knights drowned en masse, breaking the ice with their armor, or if it is a beautiful legend of cinema. But does it matter? What matters is this. April ice is treacherous. It is slippery, covered with meltwater. Blood makes it a skating rink of death. Horses broke legs, men fell under blows and did not rise again, freezing in the icy slush. For the Teutons, the battlefield turned into a branch of hell where cold burned worse than fire. Those who a minute ago felt like masters of the situation now fled in panic, pursued by Russian cavalry for 7 versts across the lake, transparent as glass. It was not just a defeat, it was a geopolitical catastrophe for the Order. The battle on the ice drew a thick, bloody line on the map of Europe. Here, on this ice, a firm no was said to the expansion of the Catholic West to the east. Drang nach Osten choked on icy water. The border between two civilizations, two worlds, froze for centuries. The Teutons realized there is nothing for them to catch in the east. People live there who do not fight by the rules and use their own nature as a weapon. Surviving knights returned to their castles in Livonia depressed. They found themselves in a strategic dead end. To the north, the impenetrable wall of Russian principalities. To the south, cursed swamps, where the flower of the Order of the Sword Brothers perished. The way east is closed. The way south is deadly dangerous. The Teutonic Order found itself locked on a narrow strip of the Baltic coast, like a wolf in a cage. But a predator cannot live without hunting. If you cannot go to Rus, then you must finish the business with those remaining in the rear, with those who still pray to Perun in their sacred groves. The gazes of the masters turned again to the center of the Baltic, to Lithuania. There, among forests and lakes, scattered princelings tore at each other's throats in a struggle for power. The Order calculated it could easily strangle them one by one, using the old Roman principle, divide and conquer. They thought they were dealing with savages, incapable of big politics. What naivety. They didn't notice how, in the shadow of their own defeats, a figure rose in Lithuania equal to them in cynicism, and surpassing them in guile. While Germans drowned in Lake Peipus and Samagidians celebrated victory at Saule, one man watched events closely. His name was Mindaugas. He was not a hero in shining armor. He was a political beast who understood a simple truth. To survive next to wolves, you must become a wolfhound yourself. He saw that old tribal unions were doomed, that against the iron machine of the Order, only a state could stand. And he decided to build this state at any cost, even if he had to drown his own brothers in blood and sell his soul to the devil. Or, even worse, the Pope. In the forests of Lithuania, a Game of Thrones began, compared to which the intrigues of European courts seemed like child's play in a sandbox. Mindaugas sharpened his knife, and this knife was intended not only for enemies, but also for friends. While Teutonic knights spat out the icy water of Lake Peipus and licked wounds in their stone burrows, deep in the rear, among impassable forests and dark rivers, something far more terrible for the Western world was happening. A new player was born.
a player who understood that this war could not be won with fury and an axe alone. In the forests of Lithuania, a man appeared who decided to play Europe's own game, but with marked cards. His name was Mindaugas. Forget the image of a noble prince from fairy tales. Mindaugas was a political animal, an apex predator who survived in the jar of spiders that was tribal Lithuania of that time. He looked at the fate of the Prussians and Curonians, ground into dust by the iron roller of the Order, and understood a simple, cruel truth. Loners die. Tribal democracy, assembly disputes, proud independent chiefs, all this is a ticket to the afterlife. To survive next to such a destruction machine as the Teutonic Order, you must become a machine yourself, a monolith. The unification of Lithuania was not a voluntary union of friends holding hands around a campfire. It was a bloodbath. Mindaugas gathered lands, not with diplomacy, but with a knife and poison. He slaughtered competitors by entire clans. He exiled his own nephews and brothers, sending them to certain death in wars with Rus, and when they returned victorious, he set mercenaries on them. Whoever is not with me is food for worms. Such was his constitution. He poured the foundation of the future state with the blood of his own tribesmen, because he knew time is running out. The Order's iron fist is already raised to strike. But Mindaugas' genius appeared not in the ability to kill his own. Many knew how to do that. His genius appeared the moment he understood how to stop the Crusaders without a single shot. He performed the most cynical and brilliant geopolitical maneuver of the 13th century. He decided to get baptized. Imagine the face of the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order when he was brought the news. The chief pagan, that very son of the devil, for whose destruction the Order received money and blessings from all of Europe, suddenly declares he wants to become a faithful son of the Catholic Church. It was checkmate. The Order existed for only one purpose: holy war against infidels. If Lithuania becomes Christian, the knights are stripped of their reason for existence. They are stripped of jobs, funding, and the right to land. Mindaugas did not just ask for baptism. He appealed directly to the Pope, over the Germans' heads. He bought himself a crown at the price of betraying the faith of his ancestors. But was it faith? For Mindaugas, gods were just pieces on the board. If Perun cannot protect against crossbows, then another god is needed, a god who gives legal immunity. In the year 1251, this spectacle took place. Mindaugas, along with his wife and court, accepted baptism. One can only guess what was going on in his soul when holy water was poured on his head. Most likely, cold calculation. He looked at the bishops not as saviors of his soul, but as useful idiots who brought him a shield impenetrable to the Order's swords. A papal bull. A document forbidding the touching of a newly converted king. 2 years later, in the summer of 1253, he was crowned. Mindaugas became the first and only king of Lithuania.
Europe applauded. The savages have civilized. They did not see that this civilized king continued to secretly sacrifice to pagan gods in sacred groves, just to be safe. They did not see that under the mask of a humble Christian hid the same forest wolf who had simply bought time. And he used this time with frightening efficiency. While Crusaders, gritting their teeth, were bound by papal bans on war, Mindaugas built. He built not just castles, he built a vertical of power. Yesterday's scattered clans turned into an army. Yesterday's elders became governors. Lithuania was turning before one's eyes from a territory into a state. Mindaugas implemented Western technologies, adopted stone building tactics, created diplomatic ties.
He used the truce to turn Lithuania into a hedgehog that was impossible to swallow. But any deal with the devil has a price, and the price of Mindaugas's crown was monstrous.
To appease the order and prove his loyalty to the Pope, he was forced to give away part of his lands to be torn apart. He gifted the Crusaders Samogitia, that very rebellious, wild Samogitia, which was the heart of Baltic paganism and fury. He effectively sold his most loyal and fanatical warriors into slavery to the Germans in exchange for peace for the rest of Lithuania. It was an act of supreme political cynicism. Mindaugas sacrificed a pawn to save the king, but he underestimated the pawn. Samogitians are not people who can simply be transferred by inventory like a sack of grain. These were the people who smashed the Sword Brothers at Saule, people for whom freedom was more important than life, and loyalty to old gods was more important than the king's orders. When Teutonic knights, waving Mindaugas's deed of gift, entered the Samogitan forests to establish their order there, they expected obedience from the subjects of the Christian king. Instead, they met hatred that had been accumulating for decades. The Samogitians felt betrayed twice, by their king, who sold them for a gold circlet, and by the new god, who came to them with fire and sword. The forest began to whisper curses again. In the thickets of Samogitia, rage boiled, capable of burning any political treaties. Mindaugas thought he was controlling the situation, but he lit the fuse of a bomb that was supposed to blow up the entire region. And this explosion would happen at Lake Durbe, where betrayal would become valor, and slaves would remember how to hold weapons. Samogitia, which King Mindaugas tossed at the feet of the Teutons with a lordly gesture, turned out to be a piece of poisoned meat. The knight, used to taking what was his by right of the strong, did not understand that a signed paper on land transfer does not change the physics of hatred. The order, intoxicated by diplomatic success, decided the deed was done. All that remained was to come and register the property. In July of the year 1260, the combined forces of the Teutonic and Livonian orders moved out on a punitive campaign. The goal was simple: finally break the back of the Samogitians who refused to recognize new masters. Look at the composition of this army. It is critically important for understanding the coming catastrophe. In the center, elite encased in steel, brother knights, professionals of war. But there were few of them. The main mass of the troops consisted of the rabble, forcibly mobilized Estonians, Curonians, and Prussians. Those very conquered peoples whom the Germans considered broken. They were driven to war with a whip, forced to kill their own brothers in misfortune. Knights looked at them from their high saddles as expendable material, as a human shield. They were sure that fear of the master's whip was stronger than the call of blood. It was a fatal mistake. Arrogance is a drug that kills slower than poison, but more reliably. The army approached Lake Durbe, a place ideally suited for tragedy. A narrow isthmus, swampy banks, lack of room for maneuver. The Samogitians were already waiting for them. 4,000 enraged pagans who had nothing to lose. But the main event did not happen at the moment the vanguards clashed. The main event happened in the rear, in the heads of those very slaves driven to die for others' interests. Now ask yourself a question, looking into the eyes of history. Would you kill free people so that your master becomes even richer? Would you defend someone who yesterday burned your village and made your wife a concubine? The Curonians marching in the rearguard of the Order's army asked themselves this question, and they didn't like the answer. The spark flared instantly. According to one version, the Curonians demanded the knights return their women and children captured in the Samogitian camp, but received an arrogant refusal. "A slave has no right to loot," they were told. At that second, the discipline held by fear evaporated. Instead of attacking the Samogitians, the Curonians and Estonians turned their spears and struck their masters in the back. It was not a riot, it was an execution. Imagine the horror of a knight fighting a Samogitian in front and suddenly feeling his own squire cutting his hamstrings from behind. The Order's army found itself in a layer cake of death. From the front, Samogitians pressed them. From the rear and flanks, rising Curonians cut them. The formation crumbled instantly. Heavy cavalry, squeezed in a narrow space, mixed into a heap. Horses trampled infantry. Knights hacked their own, trying to break out of the ring. But the ring tightened like a noose. The Battle of Durbe turned into a massacre the likes of which the Baltic had never seen. No prisoners were taken for ransom here. Here they killed with pleasure, venting anger for decades of humiliation. Chroniclers dryly, like accountants, record losses. But behind these numbers stands the collapse of an entire system. 150 brother knights remained lying in the mud by Lake Durbe. Think about this figure. 150. These are not just soldiers. This is the highest officer corps, the elite, the generals of two orders. The master of the Livonian Order, Burkhard von Hornhausen, died. The Marshal of Prussia, Henry Botel, died. The entire command was decapitated. For the Middle Ages, the loss of 150 knights is equivalent to the loss of an entire aircraft carrier fleet in our days. It was a catastrophe from which it is impossible to recover simply by recruiting new recruits. A knight is trained from the age of 5. His armor costs like a village, and all this was destroyed in a few hours of fury by yesterday's slaves. The Teutonic Order, which seemed like a monolith, suddenly turned out to be a colossus with feet of clay. The echo of the Battle of Durbe spread through the forests faster than the wind. It was a signal. They can be beaten! They are mortal! Baltic tribes, whom the Order considered pacified, raised their heads. The Great Prussian Uprising began. Prussians, led by their chiefs, began methodically slaughtering German garrisons, burning churches, and drowning priests. The ground under the Crusaders' feet literally caught fire. From hunters, they turned into game, locked in their stone castles, looking from the walls at the sea of fire raging around. The Order was on the verge of total destruction. And what about Mindaugas? That cunning fox who brewed this porridge? He watched, and when he saw the scales tip, he made his move. He did not save his Christian brothers. He laughed in their faces. Mindaugas publicly renounced Christianity. He tore the cross off himself, kicked out the bishops, and lit the fires on the altars of the old gods again. "I only got baptized so you would leave me alone," was his message. All his Europeanization turned out to be a brilliant bluff. He used the Pope as a human shield, and when the shield was no longer needed, he threw it away. Lithuania dropped the mask. No more bowing to the West, no more attempts to become one of us in the Catholic world. The Battle of Durbe showed Europe understands only the language of force, and Lithuania now had this force in abundance. Mindaugas, having united the tribes and cynically used diplomacy, stood at the head of a power that not only survived, but became the dominant predator in the region. The Order was crushed. Rus was weakened by the Mongol invasion. Scandinavians had long lost their former greatness. The power vacuum in Eastern Europe required filling. Forest clans that started as victims of Viking raids went through hell, hardened in the fire of betrayals and battles, and were now ready for the most important step. They stopped defending. They prepared to attack. History made a full turn. Those who were driven into swamps now looked at the world map not as a shelter, but as their future possessions. On the ruins of Teutonic ambitions and the ash of burned cities, the dawn of a new era was beginning. an era where the Baltic forest would grow to the size of an empire stretching from sea to sea. Look at the map of 14th century Europe. Look closely. You will see a stain there spreading like ink on wet paper. These are no longer those scattered tribes hiding in swamps from Swedish raids. These are not desperate partisans setting ambushes for Teutonic knights in the mud. This is a Leviathan. On the ruins of Viking and Crusader ambitions, on the ash of burned cities and the bones of invincible armies, a new superpower grew: the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. History loves irony. Those whom the civilized world called savages and pagan rabble for centuries built a state that, in its size, outdid the Holy Roman Empire, France, and England. Yesterday's victim, having passed through the crucible of total war, turned into the perfect predator. They survived where other peoples vanished without a trace. Prussians dissolved into German order, Curonians assimilated, but Lithuanians didn't just stand. They rewrote the rules of the game. The architect of this miracle was Gediminas. He was no longer a forest chief with a club, but a sophisticated politician of European scale, cynical and pragmatic to the bone. He realized that a sword is good, but diplomacy and economics kill more reliably. Gediminas started writing letters. Imagine, a pagan ruler sends out resumes of his state to all Hanseatic cities. "Come to us," he wrote to craftsmen and merchants. "We have low taxes, we are safe, and we don't care what god you pray to, as long as you work for the good of the crown." And people came. While Europe suffocated from religious intolerance and Inquisition bonfires, in Vilnius, the new capital that grew according to legend thanks to a dream about an iron wolf, Catholic monks, Orthodox priests, and pagan priests lived peacefully side by side. But this was not kindness. It was cold calculation. Gediminas and his son Algirdas understood. To hold an empire, you cannot break the back of every subject. It is easier to buy his loyalty. Lithuanian expansion to the east became a phenomenon. They did not conquer Russian lands with fire and sword like the Mongols. They came and said, "We do not destroy the old. We do not introduce the new." Russian principalities, exhausted by the Tatar yoke, looked at Lithuanians not as occupiers, but as the lesser of two evils. Lithuanian princes accepted orthodoxy, married Russian princesses, spoke their language, but at the same time kept a steel grip on the throat of geopolitics. Algirdas, son of Gediminas, turned this state into a military machine running on rocket fuel. He turned the vector of aggression south and east. The Golden Horde, that terror of the East before which all Rus trembled, suddenly discovered it had a competitor. In the Battle of Blue Waters in the year 1362, the Lithuanian army smashed the Tatar Mirzas to smithereens. It was a historical turn. The myth of Mongol invincibility collapsed, just as the myth of Vikings and Teutons had collapsed before. Lithuania took Kiev. The mother of Russian cities, the ancient capital, passed under the control of Vilnius. Now the borders of the Grand Duchy stretched from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. From sea to sea. Lithuanian horses drank water from the Dnieper and the Bug. It was an empire of paradoxes. A pagan elite ruled millions of Christians. A state without a written tradition created one of the most effective bureaucracies of its time. They became the shield of Europe. While the West despised them for paganism, it was Lithuanian regiments that held back the onslaught of the Horde from the east and the onslaught of the Teutonic Order from the west. They were the buffer against which waves of invasions crashed. Think about this path. In just a couple of centuries,
From a slave pantry where every Viking could rob villages with impunity, to emperors dictating their will to Moscow, Krakow, and Berlin. They did not ask permission for greatness from the Pope. They took it by force.
They proved that a beast driven into a corner is capable of not just snapping back, but growing, mutating, and devouring its hunters. Vikings went into sagas. The Teutonic Order rotted from within and turned into a historical relic. The Golden Horde fell apart into pieces, and Lithuania remained. This story is not about nobility. It is about survival, about the fact that morality is a luxury for well-fed and safe times. When your house is being burned and your children are being led into slavery, you have two paths: die with a prayer on your lips, or pick up an axe and become scarier than your enemy. The Baltic tribes chose the second path. They were baptized not with holy water, but with the blood of their enemies. They built their greatness on bones, but whose greatness is built differently? The history of the fury of the Baltic teaches us one uncomfortable truth. Civilization is a thin crust of ice over a dark ocean of chaos. And when the ice cracks, the winner is not the one who is more righteous, but the one who adapts faster, who is ready to break the rules, and who is not afraid to look into the abyss. They looked into it for so long that the abyss recognized them as its own. And now, knowing what price was paid for this transformation, knowing how much blood this land soaked up, answer honestly: who is the real hero here, and who is the villain? A pagan defending his home with primitive cruelty, or a civilized knight bringing the light of faith on the tip of a sword smeared with poison? And if your world were collapsing, if war came to your doorstep, where would you stop? Could you become a monster so that your children could live as kings? Or would you prefer to remain a righteous victim on the pages of someone else's history? The choice is yours. But remember, winners are not judged, they are feared.